Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversation. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insight to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. My guest today is Kirk Robinson. He is the founder of the Western Wildlife Conservancy, which began in the 1990s, whose focus is the health and well-being of Utah's ecosystems, including the ethical treatment of native carnivores, such as mountain lions, black bears, bobcats. Prior to being the executive director of the Western Wildlife Conservancy, Kirk was a professor of philosophy for 15 years. Also, in 2004, he graduated from the Quincey College of Law at the University of Utah, which has proved very useful for his work on wildlife conservation. He lives in Salt Lake City. Welcome, Kirk.
Thank you, Glenn. Glad to be with you.
Would you like to make some introductory comments?
Well, people might want to know that I actually was born and raised in Utah. I grew up in Bountiful on the shore of the Great Salt Lake. I only live a few miles from there now. I'm in Salt Lake. And I've lived in a few other states along the way. But in 1997, Western Wildlife Conservancy was founded here in Utah. I was an original founder. And we work mainly in Utah, but I'd say about half of my work time is devoted to Utah exclusive issues, and the other half involves other groups around the nation with similar interests. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later.
Okay. Regarding mountain lions, you point out that in addition to the regular annual hunt, the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, DWR, which sets policy for the state's management of wildlife, is currently engaged in a 3-year study to kill as many mountain lions as possible in 6 hunting units to see if wild deer populations rebound on these hunting units as a consequence of mountain lion removal. Would you explain to us what's going on?
I just found out about this in around the 10th of December, and there's still a lot that I don't know about it, but last Thursday there was a state wildlife board meeting that I attended, and evidently the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources and the members of the wildlife board had received quite a lot of blowback on this from various interest groups, including houndsmen, people that chase bears and cougars with hounds. And so at that wildlife board meeting, public input was taken. And all I can tell you is largely drawn from the introduction to that part of the wildlife board meeting by a biologist with the Division of Wildlife Resources, and partly from other people through other channels. But evidently, BYU, Brigham Young University, the home of the cougars, ironically, or at least someone in the life sciences area, collaborated with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources and came up with this scheme. And partly, so I hear, it is to serve a graduate student who needs a research project for his or her PhD. but it's a really extreme experiment. And I do not believe that that's the only motivation behind it. I think it's coming from powerful people in the Utah legislature who insist that in order to be funded from the general fund, the Division of Wildlife Resources needs to do more to promote the growth of deer herds in the state. Mm-hmm. In any case, the idea is that they will intensively cull mountain lions in 6 of the state hunting units. For those that are familiar with Utah, you might recognize some of the names. Starting in the south, the Zion unit adjacent to Zion National Park, Pine Valley, Boulder Mountain near Torrey, and Monroe Mountain near Richfield, Wasatch East. It's along the Wasatch here where I live, but on the east side of the range, and also Stansbury, which is west of the Ochre Mountains here, and south of the Great Salt Lake. The idea is to remove as many mountain lions as they can and see what happens to the deer herds. It's a 3-year project right now. Theoretically, it could be terminated after 3 years or extended. Just a word about the word rebound. That begs the question right away as to whether or not the deer herds on those units are lower than they should be. Who decides what the population size should be? I think nature generally does that. And the Division of Wildlife Resources has aspirational goals, and they try to promote deer herd growth in various ways. And one of the main ones is so-called predator control. So I'm skeptical about the whole thing from the get-go. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that's what's going on, and they've hired private trappers to do this, one or more, and snares are being used primarily, mm-hmm. and they grip an animal around the neck, and as the animal tries to free itself, cuts off the blood supply flowing to and from the brain, may choke them too. In any case, it's a painful and not a very quick death. If they're caught by a paw, then the trapper shows up later and shoots the animal. Mm-hmm. And I have no idea how many have been killed this way so far, but it seems like it's way out of order.
Mm-hmm. Well, why are they using professionals with traps and snares rather than agency people that could employ more merciful methods of killing?
Well, I think the idea is to make it efficient and effective. They want to get rid, really kill them off. And they're not worried about causing an extinction of mountain lions in Utah. These are just 6 hunting units, so they're some of the ones where most of the mountain lions live. Mm-hmm. But other mountain lions will immigrate into the vacant home ranges in time after the experiment is concluded, if it ever is. So, they just want to expedite the experiment to see what happens. Mm-hmm. And I assume that's partly for the sake of this graduate student. He or she needs data to complete the thesis or dissertation.
Okay. So let me ask you this question, because I listened to your comments on YouTube, and I sort of restated what I think you are saying, and I want to read this sentence or two to you, and you can tell me if you think this is a fair statement of your perspective. You argue that they are using scientific methods to achieve ends based on values that they have already decided upon. In this case, the mountain lion study values more mule deer. So they are funding a study to show that mountain lions reduce mule deer populations in order to blame mountain lions for a declining mule deer population, rather than looking into other reasons why this is happening. Is that a fair statement of what you're saying?
Yeah, I'd say so. When we talk about scientific methods, I mean, they're just using standard research protocols. And I suppose whatever data they came up with, you would have to say were obtained through scientific research.
Mm-hmm.
But, a lot of people assume that because of the authoritative position in society that these agencies hold with biologists educated at universities, that they're looking out for the good of wildlife, and that somehow science dictates what they need to do. This is how it was presented at that wildlife board meeting on January 8th. The chief point I wanted to make, well, one of two, is that science never dictates anything about what you have to do. There's a whole background that is in play, in this case for the agency people. They already have certain interests. And as I mentioned earlier, these interests can be shaped to a large extent by the legislature and the funding mechanisms by which the agency is funded. There's a big emphasis on mule deer and having larger herds of mule deer in Utah. And they have declined in the last decade or so fairly dramatically. When I grew up in the 50s, I remember when I was about 3 or 4 years old in the early 50s, my family moved to Bountiful. It was the south part of town, and our house was built on part of a peach orchard, and that peach orchard extended for quite a long ways behind the house and east of the house. And in the winter, the deer would come into our yard out of the mountains. We were only a couple of miles away from the Wasatch Mountains there. And I used to dress up in my snowsuit and boots and go out on the porch and watch them. In those days, there were maybe twice as many mule deer in Utah as there are now. So it's an interesting question why the number has declined. But the short answer is loss of habitat. Our house was sitting on former deer winter range. And since that time, Bountiful, when we moved there, the 1950 census had the population of Bountiful at 6,004. Now it's pushing 50,000, I think, and the houses are way up on the Bonneville shoreline, 1,000 feet above the surface of the Great Salt Lake. When I was a young boy, those houses weren't there, and I could walk right up to Mueller Park and Mill Creek Canyon through what was essentially wild country. That's long gone now. But the short answer, habitat destruction. But, of course, also the population, along with the population growth comes more cars and more trucks and more roads. And so more and more animals are being killed on highways. And then there's always an unknown but probably significant amount of poaching as well. We've been in a drought for the last several years, and that impacts ungulates like deer too. In fact, it's probably the most significant single indicator of what you can expect of the deer herd, how much moisture has fallen in the areas where they live, because that'll affect plant growth, plants that they eat. So all of those factors are in play. And, of course, the biologists know all of this. They're not ignorant. These state wildlife agencies have conducted many of the research projects that have allowed us to know more about mountain lions and mule deer and predator-prey relationships. They know these things, but they have a political agenda.
Okay. So you have called for a science in the interest of moral ends. Could you say more about this?
Well, I would put that a little differently, Glenn. I'm not calling for a science of anything. Just recognize, that as far as wildlife conservation management goes, science is always going to be part of it. Indeed, that's part of the North American model of wildlife conservation that I think we'll get to in a little bit.
Yes.
But since science doesn't dictate what you must do, it only gives you information to help you decide what to do. I think it's time that people like me and my colleagues focus more on ethics and values. When we go to these wildlife board meetings, and in other states are usually called wildlife commission meetings, what I've observed over the years, and I actually began going to these meetings here in Utah in 1989, so I've had a lot of exposure to the institution and the way it functions. People try to teach the wildlife managers about the science. And this is the very information that those wildlife managers and their colleagues in the agencies around the nation produce through research. And that's never going to help anything. What we need to do, I think, is start making the first point that science doesn't tell us what we need to do. And then the second point, here's what ethics demands of us. Now, that's not an easy ask, but I think that's where the focus needs to be, on ethics.
Mm-hmm. Would you agree that the science of conservation biology, as it emerged in the 90s under the direction of people such as Michael Soley, Reed Noss, Dave Parsons, and many others, is an advocacy science? And it is the model in many ways for how all science should serve life on Earth.
I basically agree with that. I knew Michael Soley personally and spent time with him. I also knew Dave Foreman, and I know Dave Parsons. He's a friend of mine. I've been associated with the rewilding project for a long time, and before that, Wildlands Network. And so I am familiar with all of that, and also with Aldo Leopold and the land ethic. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Soule. In 1995, I believe it was, he published What is Conservation Biology? And in that seminal article, he lists certain, searching for the right word,
principles?
Well, it's not the one that he used, but that we can call them principles. And there were two sets, and the set I want to focus on have to do with values. Mm-hmm. So one of them is the evolutionary process is good. Another one was biodiversity is good. And another one is that wild animals have intrinsic value. That's Soule. It goes a little beyond Aldo Leopold because, so far as I know, Leopold never did say explicitly that individual wild animals have intrinsic value. And I'm hoping I'm remembering Soule accurately. But in any case, right there you have the basis for an ethic. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do in any situation, but it does put the emphasis on the importance of conserving wildlife, shall we say, for its own sake.
Mm-hmm.
and not for some utilitarian purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's why I mentioned the science of conservation biology, because it seems to me they have integrated ethics into their science. But let me ask you this. I believe the state of Utah is about 2/3 public land. In your view, how much of this land needs to be wilderness or strictly protected for the sake of viable carnivore populations?
Well, as you probably know, and probably most of the listeners know, Utah consists of a lot of island mountain ranges and high plateaus separated by low-lying desert country. And there are a few major rivers in Utah, the Green and the Colorado being the primary ones, but also the Escalante and the Virgin. And I think it's mainly these high mountain areas and the river corridors that need protection. I have never thought of it in terms of total acreage inside the state, but I don't think we need to protect the salt flats for the sake of any wild animals, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think for me it's more, in Utah, it would be more of a case for the geography of the area and what parts of the state support abundant wild animal populations and biodiversity. And in that connection also, where parts of Utah connect up with other wild places in other states. For example, Dinosaur National Monument in northeastern Utah extends into northwestern Colorado. And also the Book Cliffs near where you live extends into Colorado, just north of Grand Junction. And the La Salle's further south. And on the west, we have the Deep Creeks and other ranges along the border with Nevada and so on. So it's very important to keep in mind that it's not just a matter of protecting good habitat inside Utah, but also making sure that it connects up with other habitat used by the same species in other states.
Would you say that the primary purpose of public land should be to protect and restore biodiversity?
Primary? I don't know about that, but I'd say it's at least co-equal with the others. But in cases where you have to, well, and the others, of course, would be utilitarian uses of the land, water, for instance, being one of them. But in cases of conflict, I would always want to err on the side of protecting habitat and wildlife. I think that's prudent for a number of reasons. And, but we have to be concerned about the human population, too. We're part of the whole thing. So I hope that's a sufficient answer.
Would you say that the multiple use model is an incoherent ideal?
I don't think you can elaborate on it in a way that's very coherent and helpful. Mm-hmm. The more general it is, the safer it seems, let's say. It's hard to, it's easy to swallow because it sounds good. Mm-hmm. But when you actually have to deal with the things on the ground, the land and the plants and animal, water and all of that, and human demands, then you have to, of course, make trade-offs. And all the agencies have in the way of a mandate is that you've got to somehow, quote, balance all these things or consider them all at least. But it doesn't tell you what you must do or even what a balance would be. Mm-hmm. Balance is, I think, not a very helpful metaphor to be used in these contexts. I think it obscures the issues a lot. It's used to as a point of argument oftentimes by competing sides, each saying that the other person is overreaching, and we need to have a balance. So,
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks. The state of Utah is the home of the Sagebrush Rebellion, with individuals such as James Watt leading the charge. He was, as you know, the Secretary of the Interior under Reagan. Why do you think this mentality to take back federal lands is so strong in Utah?
well, first of all, just a brief story about my own history. I went to graduate school in philosophy at the University of Cincinnati, and I was there from fall of 1976 through the spring of 1981. And there were so few jobs in philosophy in those days, and I had not yet finished my dissertation, that I decided not to stay there. And I'd also exhausted all the financial help I could get from the university there. But also, I'd grown up in the West, and I was very fond of the geography of the West and the history of the West, and wanted to live in the West, the Rocky Mountain West. So I chose to come back here and take my chances on a career in philosophy and at least live where I wanted to live. And part of that reason in that was I wanted to help protect the natural values of the West. Reagan was in office at that time, and James Watt, as you mentioned, was Secretary of Interior, and he gained a lot of notoriety for his draconian ideas. And I wanted to be part of the resistance to help protect Utah wildlands and wildlands throughout the West. To get directly to your question, I think it goes back to the pioneer heritage that we share with other Western states. Of course, there's a particular Mormon flavor to it. And I'm familiar with that because I was raised a Mormon, and I was a Mormon missionary in the Bay Area in Northern California from 1967 through spring of 69. So I kind of know both sides of these issues. I've lived with them. And I will mention that I'm no longer with that religion. I opted out quite a long time ago. But anyway, getting back to the pioneers, they here that pioneer heritage is almost worshipped. And the lifestyle that goes with it, ranching and farming, that is protected at all costs. I'll give you one quick example. Everyone knows that the Great Salt Lake is drying up. Everyone knows that we're in a drought. Right now, I think this is the driest winter to date I've ever experienced in this area. The ski resorts above me really have very low amounts of snow compared to what it was just a couple of years ago. So what about that? Well, there are three major rivers that flow from the western end of the Uintas into the Great Salt Lake, which is a terminal watershed, as people know. It doesn't flow to the sea. The Bear River on the north, the Weber River in the center, and the Provo River, which flows into Utah Lake and Utah Valley, then through the Jordan River into the south arm of the Great Salt Lake. There's been a lot of growth along the Wasatch Front, and we're using a lot more water now than we ever did. But these rivers aren't supplying as much water as they used to either. And the main consumer of water, guess what? It's agriculture. It's not municipal. Well, municipal water use is significant, and so is the use of water by businesses and corporations and universities and churches and things like that. But the Bear River, for example, flows for more than 500 miles from the northwest part of the Uinta Mountains into southwest Wyoming, right through Evanston, Wyoming, into Utah, and eventually into the north part of Bear Lake, which is in Idaho, and immediately out again, then around some more mountains, the Bear River Mountains, in fact, they're called, and then south into Cache Valley, where Logan is, and then into the Great Salt Lake. I'm mentioning all of that because that's all agricultural country.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the main crops is alfalfa, which is the most thirsty of all the crops. And, right now our Utah legislature has passed legislation that allows the state to pay these ranchers and farmers to not grow alfalfa. But it turns out that not many of them are taking them up on that. The point is, if they weren't growing so much alfalfa, there would be more water for the lake, hence more water for the millions of birds that rely on the lake, and there would be other benefits as well. There are over 800 square kilometers of exposed lake bed right now, and when dust storms come up, oftentimes we get big clouds of yellowish brown gunk in the air here. So, and it's got chemicals like arsenic in it. It's a very unhealthy situation.
Okay,
That's
well, let
the
me.
politics of Utah.
Gotcha. Okay, well, let me go on to the next question here. We have only about 25 minutes left. Okay, you have said that much of the economy of Utah has been tied to grazing for a long time. But now, more and more, you point out that real estate and recreation are becoming prominent. Could you rank these three economic activities in terms of their harm to Utah's ecosystems, or do you think they are all pretty much equally bad?
Well, I've never really pondered that question. Recreation to an extent is good, and some forms of recreation are not so good. I don't favor more ATV trails, for instance. Livestock grazing is definitely not good for the ecosystems. It is bad in a number of ways. I don't think I'll spend time on that.
Okay.
And what was the third thing?
Well, grazing, which was the longest running, and then you mentioned in my reading of your writings, real estate and recreation, and you say they're catching up with the damage done by grazing.
Well, I don't ever recall making that explicit comparison, but they're obviously they take away the wildness of the land, and they displace animals, and they alter their habitats. And so, if we want to conserve wildlife, we've got to do there's got to be limits on all of these things, and they have to be done in the most environmentally friendly way we can do them. That's all I have to say.
Okay, well, I take that to mean they're pretty much equally bad. So you criticize the dominant North American model of wildlife conservation, which you regard as a farm model, with carnivores viewed as weeds. Would you expand on this and explain why you don't want to be on any wildlife commission board as they are currently structured?
Well, I don't want to be on one because it would take up a lot of time and I wouldn't be able to do what I do now. Mm-hmm. Plus, they are structured in such a way that my vote wouldn't count. So enough said about that. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to comment on your other question. I'm looking right now at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies' formulation of the 7 tenets of the North American model of wildlife conservation. And by North America, we mean, in this case, the United States and Canada, which share pretty much the same model. This model, such as it was developed in the 90s by 3 wildlife biologists and sportsmen. And it was supposed that at the time that it was descriptive of what these wildlife agencies in fact do. But it, in fact, takes on a prescriptive meaning too, because insofar as they the practice goes, they use this North American model as a justification for many of the things that they actually do. And I was adding a little bit to that in what you read. Mm-hmm. So when the agencies like the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources actually engages in so-called wildlife management in the state, they favor certain species over others. And the previous discussion of the mule deer experiment, cougar mule deer experiment here in Utah, is exemplary of that. But the North American wildlife model itself does not prescribe that. It just allows for it. Mm. There are various things wrong with the model, and I would say one of them is the number 4 on the list I'm looking at. Wildlife may only be killed for a legitimate, non-frivolous purpose. Mm-hmm. Well, it's killing mountain lions with neck snares, using hired trappers to see whether or not you get a slight boost in the mule deer population. Is that legitimate, non-frivolous? I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you worry that more democracy on the wildlife boards might still not accomplish the urgent task of protecting species that are unpopular or feared? Before you answer that question, I want to say that the reason I ask this question is because in 2024, the majority of people in Colorado voted against Proposition 127, which would have ended the trophy hunting of mountain lions and the unlimited trapping of bobcats. So no one twisted their arms to vote the way they did. Was this a failed experiment in democracy?
No, I don't think it was. It's a sad result, of course, and I hope another try is made. But, I am one of the founders, you might say, of a new group on the scene, Wildlife for All. You might have heard of it. Dave Parsons is in on that, too. And part of the mission of Wildlife for All, which incidentally has gained a lot of attention across the nation, is to make wildlife governance more democratic. So people like me, for instance, really don't have much influence in the present system. And if the wildlife boards and commissions were more representative of the diversity of the points of view and other legitimate interests in the states, then that would make for better governance overall. And in a situation like that, I think it would be easier to make advances. Mm-hmm. Am I optimistic that it would solve all our problems? By no means.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The work of your organization is based on both ecological science and environmental ethics. How have you been able to use this discipline in philosophy, known as environmental ethics, to support and promote your conservation work?
Initially, I was interested pretty much in epistemology mainly, and also philosophy mind. But I developed an interest in conservation, as I explained earlier, while I was a graduate student. And after I finished my dissertation, I started thinking more about conservation and eventually more about ethics. And for quite a long time, I wasn't relying on any particular philosophical view. I was just doing my own thinking about these issues. informed by philosophy, of course. But recently, I read a book by a Harvard professor of philosophy emeritus, Christine Korsgaard, book published in 2018 called Fellow Creatures, Our Obligations to the Other Animals. It's not an easy read, but I was very, very much impressed with it. Mm-hmm. And it's helped me rethink my views on a lot of things and think through them much more extensively. And it's made me more interested in pursuing ethics, conservation ethics now. And I mentioned earlier, I think we need more of it now. We need more of it because it needs to be part of the fight. You can't, it can't be a battle of the scientists. Science seeks truth, but how it's used, as we talked about earlier, depends on values and political pressures and things like that. And we're not going to win if that's all we have. We need to start talking about ethics. So I'm very much interested in it now, and my ideas have been very much influenced by Korsgaard.
Okay. Beyond ecology, what is the ethical argument for protecting predators and wild lands?
Well, I believe that we have an ethical obligation to do good by wild animals, and that includes protecting their habitat. They're sentient beings, like we are, and Korsgaard's convinced me that we are no more important than them in any sense, and not in any sense that has any moral significance. We're just like them, trying to get through life, and if we have dignity as human beings that should be respected morally, then they do too.
Mm-hmm. So this is a big question, and I'm not looking so much for answers to some of these questions as just to get your comments on them. So if I ask you, why wilderness? What is the most basic, simple, and straightforward reply in your point of view?
Protect wildlife habitat.
Why wilderness?
Yes. Number one reason, in my opinion, is to protect it for the benefit of wildlife because they depend on it existentially. But I think it's secondarily very important for human beings also. We need wilderness, whether we know it or not.
I agree. I believe the Western Wildlife Conservancy is against the hunting of carnivores. Is this position based on science or ethics or both?
Well, both. A person might wonder, well, if you're against hunting of cougars and bears, why not against deer and elk as well? There's a longer explanation there than I want to get into, but part of it has to do with democracy. But the reason that we should make an exception for the carnivores, large and medium-sized, in my opinion, is that they regulate their own numbers, and they help keep prey populations healthy. They help keep the land healthy. And along with that, they are sentient creatures, as I said, with lives and needs that we should morally respect.
Yes, I have some questions on that later on, but let me ask you this. In one of your essays, you confessed to killing an owl at the age of 12 or 13. And you say that remorse very soon began to set in, and that this memory has remained with you for more than 60 years. Do you agree with what E.O. Wilson calls biophilia, or the innate love for wild animals? Stated somewhat differently, Do you think we are born with a conscience that pains us when we harm life for no good reason?
I was 16 when I killed that owl. It was 1964. But that's just a minor point. In any case, remorse began to set in just a few minutes later. I felt emotionally that there's something wrong with this. When I had to confront the dead owl and his eyes still wide open looking up at me as I laid on the ground, and then trying to salvage a few feathers for trophies, it just seems such a waste. But, as far as biophilia goes, I think it may be in there somewhere for most people, but it's not obvious that it's there for everyone. And even for many ordinary people, I think it's latent and might be overlaid with a lot of other stuff. Mm-hmm. We grow up in a culture here in the West where that's what you did. You get a gun and you go out and shoot things, varmints. It was in magazines and so forth. And you see it, we used to see it on TV shows and movies and stories. And there was deer hunting and elk hunting and fishing. And so I think the predominant attitude was wildlife is there for us to do what we choose to do with it. And that aside, and also young people can be very cruel to wild animals. Mm-hmm. I've seen this all my life with my friends and even me in some cases. And I don't know how to explain that, but it just seems wrong. So is there such a thing as biophilia? I think there is, but and I think it is rooted in human nature somewhere, but I'm not competent to delineate exactly what it is.
Okay. You say in one of your essays that since you were young, and I quote you, I have always wished that I could see mountain lions in the wild. Could you try to capture in a few words what you find in encounters with wild animals in wild places that you cannot find anywhere else?
Well, one thing is you see how the world in its most basic elements functions. And, it's the kind of framework we need for understanding everything else in life. It's very fundamental. And it's helps set your thinking right, I think, in various ways. But also, it connects you with your own mortality and then your relative insignificance in the whole scheme of things. And I think that is, well, for me, it's a very powerful experience. And it's somehow essential to me. I need it to feel really alive and to have some sense of what I'm doing or should try to do instead of just living day to day, working from means to ends like we have to do most of the time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I want to return to the subject of carnivores and wolves in particular because Colorado is in the middle of a wolf recovery program. And because, as you note, eventually wolves will be coming to Utah, probably under their own volition. What principles, moral and otherwise, should guide how Utah responds to wolves coming into the state?
Currently, we have a law that requires the state authorities, the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, to request the federal government to remove any wolves that stray into part of northern Utah. The part that's included in the North American or the Northern Rockies gray wolf distinct population segment. It includes roughly the Bear River Range and some surrounding areas. That was included, by the way, in the distinct population segment because when the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, it was known that they would proliferate and eventually they could come into Utah and into the Uintas and from the Uintas into Colorado. But as we know now, they've been delisted in Wyoming, and southwest Wyoming is a kill zone. And if any wolves do make it into northern Utah, then right now they would be taken away. Now, if wolves become delisted, taken off the Endangered Species Act in other parts of Utah, perhaps in the entire state, then another part of the law requires the Division of Wildlife Resources to ensure that a viable pack does not become established. Now, that can only mean one thing. Mm-hmm. You got to kill them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In addition to the livestock industry's opposition to wolf recovery, how much weight would you give to traditions such as hunting and trapping with regard to the decline of carnivore species everywhere?
Well, we know what it did to wolves. And right now we see what's happening in Utah. I understand New Mexico's bad too. I don't know to what extent that contributes to population levels, but too much hunting and trapping of carnivore species obviously isn't good for the individual animals themselves, and it can also do damage to the social structure in ways that cause all kinds of problems. There's no need for trapping in today's world. There's just no need for it.
Mm-hmm.
And, speaking of the North American model, one of the tenets says that there shall be no commerce in dead wildlife. And what about all the bobcat skins that are sold on the international market? Seems to me that that's commerce in wildlife. Somehow it's just not included. But there's no need to kill them. We should learn about them, marvel at them, respect them, and otherwise leave them alone.
Mm-hmm. What do you say about the situation that some Native American tribes practice ecologically damaging grazing and they hunt carnivores on their land? In Colorado, the Southern Utah Tribal Council opposed the reintroduction of wolves, Proposition 114, in 2020. So the question is, should indigenous sovereignty allow for different ethical standards regarding the treatment of wild animals, especially carnivores?
Well, I think the answer is yes and no, and I'll explain. Because they are sovereign nations, I think we need to respect them. And incidentally, the Uinta-Ure Reservation here in the Uinta Valley, south of the Uinta Mountains, which incidentally run east and west just south of the Wyoming border, they take in the same approach. The state of Utah has a memorandum of agreement with them that they will not, that they oppose any reintroduction of wolves into the state. And they don't want wolves on their land. They graze livestock. Okay, so that's one part of it. You can't just run in there and tell them what they have to do. Do I think they're right? No, I think they're wrong. Why shouldn't, right and wrong isn't a matter of, in my opinion, of what you just happen to believe. It's a matter of objectivity. It's a matter of facts, and it's a matter of reason. And, I can see killing carnivores if your livelihood depends on livestock, and that's your only recourse. But you can take steps to protect your livestock from carnivores. We know what they are. They're non-lethal methods of various kinds now. And you can learn how to live with wolves and cougars and other animals. And I think that's what they ought to do. I don't know why it should be any different for Native Americans. They're human beings, just like we are. Now, somebody could argue against that and say, well, there is no truth of the matter about what's morally right. But then that's where I would disagree with them.
Mm-hmm. Why is it important for citizens to go before advisory and agency board members on behalf of wildlife and wilderness, since you acknowledge that you have been doing this for decades and they overwhelmingly discount your comments?
Yeah, I think it's important for it to be part of the record. For one thing, right now, we're engaged in a lawsuit with the state of Utah on its cougar management. This is quite apart from the experiment we talked about. And, we claim standing in large part because we've been looking out for mountain lions all along and commented at public meetings. But also it can have an influence on the opinions of the board members. They're supposed to take public input. And when they hear overwhelming criticism of some of their ideas, they're supposed to think about it and talk about it, and there's always the possibility that they'll change their minds. So, And I think it's important for people to get involved and to know what the issues are. That's a big problem here in Utah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you motivate them to do this?
Mm-hmm. So you want them to be honest about their underlying values, and I think your basic idea and strategy is that by helping people to become aware of their underlying values, they might begin to question them and ultimately to change them. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, that's rather idealistic. I'm sure there are some people like that. I try to be that way myself. I think that is that's the mindset of a philosopher. Perhaps you'd agree.
I would.
But I think to a large extent, of a scientist as well. One of the points Coors Guard makes that I think is very interesting is that science and morality are, as it were, outgrowths of the same kind of rationality of a particular kind that human beings share. But I'm more pessimistic than optimistic because I know that people they don't operate on that level very often. They are more responsive to pressures of various kinds. Most people.
Mm-hmm. It's clear from your writings that you have a high regard for Aldo Leopold. He is best known for his land ethic, in which he holds, and I quote for our audience, in case they don't already know this, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." End quote. The upshot of Leopold's environmental ethic, I think you will agree, is that the biotic community is the ultimate value, and he doesn't concern himself very much, it can be argued, with the intrinsic value of individual organisms. Following this way of thinking, which I believe can be characterized as thinking like a mountain, you argue, quote, all value is extrinsic value, related to the needs and interest of sentient creatures, end quote. So my question is, why not hold that the wolf and the owl, for examples, have both intrinsic value and extrinsic value?
Well, I have defined intrinsic value as a value that, if there is such a thing, some things, sentient creatures among them perhaps, have a kind of value just as a result of their very being. And I don't know how to make good philosophical sense of that. I know what job we want it to do. We want it to be a basis for a morality of a kind. But as far as it goes, in that respect, with Aldo Leopold, it tells us to protect ecosystems or the biotic community. And that's great as far as it goes, but it doesn't address certain issues. And one of the more prominent ones is illustrated today by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's decision to kill up to, I believe, 450,000 barred owls in the barred owls in the Northwest in an attempt to keep the endemic population of spotted owls from going extinct. Because the Endangered Species Act more or less mandates that. And I think that was the Endangered Species Act captures Leopold's main idea. I don't want to reject Leopold outright, but I think we have to make room for, let's call it, the value of individual creatures too. But my point in saying that all value is extrinsic is not that all value is utilitarian value or exchange value or anything like that. I think what I argue in some of my writings following Korsgaard again is that you can make sense of the moral standing of certain creatures on the basis of the kind of creatures they are and how they make their way through the world, just as you can do in the case of human beings. And I think the focus should be there. And it involves a kind of ironic twist, if you will. Very briefly, the argument is most value is functional value, which we could paraphrase as saying good for, like sunshine is good for trees. Well, various things are good for different kinds of organisms. Food in the form of deer is good for mountain lions. But why should that matter? Why does that matter to the moral standing of a mountain lion, for instance? Well, once again, they are conscious beings. They experience the world through their senses in a valenced way, roughly speaking, things that are good for them and things that are bad for them. And they are intelligent to the extent that they can learn how to get instinctive, of course, thought functions foremost, but it can be modified through learning how to get what they want. Mountain lion kitten will learn how to hunt from its mother, for instance. And in doing that, it's showing that its final good is to stay alive and in good condition. That's what it's trying to do. And there is no further extrinsic good beyond that. That's the end of the line. And but it's an absolute good in a way. I'm not going to elaborate on that right now. But, the philosopher Immanuel Kant had something called the categorical imperative. And he thought it only applied to human beings, that only human beings had what he called dignity, because only they were rational, and hence only they had moral standing. And he argued that we should treat animals well only because if we don't, it tends to erode our own moral sensibilities. Korsgaard's convinced me that he was just wrong about that, and that, in fact, being an end in yourself, which is what human beings are, and also what the cougar and the mountain or the deer are as well, is all that really counts. And that a version of the categorical imperative applies there. And basically it just says we should treat all creatures who are ends in themselves as having moral standing. And that means to basically not interfere with their life ways. And so, that adds a whole different point of view. And it doesn't negate Leopold. I think it soups up the whole so-called land ethic with something that we need at this time.
I understand your argument that there is no clear criteria for determining if something has intrinsic value, and that the murky concept of intrinsic value is not needed for an adequate or effective environmental ethic. I also agree with you that the concept of intrinsic value is philosophically problematic. But my question is, doesn't it resonate intuitively with many people, and for that reason alone, it may have merit?
Well, that's a very good question, and I have thought about that, and I basically agree with that. I don't think I'm going to get rid of the terminology. It's the easiest way of saying, that we believe that wild animals and domestic animals too have moral standing. And of course, even if my criticism of the philosophical concept of intrinsic value is correct, it doesn't mean at all that we shouldn't respect other animals and even love them and want to protect them. Those sentiments are still going to be there. Hopefully, an expression of biophilia full blown. So my aim is really, I want people to start thinking more about ethics. The other side of the intrinsic value thing is that's where the argument begins and ends for most of our colleagues, unfortunately. These things have intrinsic value. And I don't think that's much more effective than standing in front of the wildlife board and repeating the science to them that they already know. And we're in a state of emergency. We've got to do better. And we've got to be united. And philosophy at its very best throughout history has had a huge impact on the course of civilization. You can't separate it really from any other kind of institution or practice or tradition in society. And I'm thinking mainly of Western culture, but it's been part of the mix all along. And some philosophers have been extremely influential. And I've been involved in wildlife conservation now for 37 years. And I don't know of a single other person who's read Korsgaard, for instance. Maybe one or two have. It's not easy reading. And there's a problem there. How do we take the best of philosophy and deliver it to lay people who are intelligent and have been well educated but don't know a thing about philosophy? If we wait 200 or 300 years, supposing we have that much time, maybe it would filter down and have an effect. I'm just trying to, get the job done now, you might say.
We are not going to settle the controversial issue of intrinsic value during this interview, that's for sure. But let me ask you a few questions, not so much looking for answers, but just to get your comments. So here's the first one. If life or sentient life was extinguished on planet Earth tomorrow, would what remains still have value?
I think the question then would be value for who? If the value is extrinsic by its very nature, and in the case of a sentient creature, its life is of value to it. Staying alive is valuable for it. That's a kind of extrinsic value. It's an ironic twist on it, as I said earlier, but that's an important point. But if there are no sentient creatures, what is take Mount Everest, for instance, does it have value, or the Grand Canyon? Value for who? And there is no answer there. And if you still want to press the question, I'm not sure I even understand it at this point. What's at issue? Are we thinking maybe it would be bad for some foreign intergalactic civilization to come and blow up Mount Everest, or what exactly is the issue? I don't see an issue any longer. No. So I don't think that the question any longer has footing.
Okay. So I'm going to ask basically the same question in another way, and just to see what you say. Let us assume that there are galaxies out there without life. Do they have any value, at least in the sense that it is better that they exist than not exist?
I don't know how to answer that question.
Okay. Fair enough. So, I ask you these questions because you're a philosopher. And so the most general formulation of this question would be, is being better than non-being? And
right.
So I think you've already said that they're unanswerable, and you're probably right, but I wanted to hear what you had to say. So coming back to Earth, so to speak, I want to reformulate a question I asked you earlier. How does philosophical discussion help us solve the ecological crisis? In other words, what is the role of philosophy in this regard as compared to science?
Okay, I'm not talking about professional philosophy per se as I say this. But I think the role of philosophy should take is in trying to provide direction based on reason and fact. Philosophers typically have certain skills and knowledge that are underutilized in our society, in my opinion, and they can be helpful. And one of the things I've been saying is that one form of being, sentience, in a sense, does have value in itself. Sentient creatures value their own lives and value the continuation of their lives. And that gives them, in a sense, absolute value by making amends in themselves. Now, the argument is kind of abstract and isn't going to mean much to people at first. They need to think about it more and read about it. And there's no reason why philosophy should be watered down to the point that it's useless. It always has been intellectually demanding, and it needs to be worth anything, in my opinion. And it concerns questions, in this instance particularly, that we really need to think about all the time. And so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I like what you say. I know you hold that values cannot be determined by facts, thereby avoiding what is known in philosophical discourse as the naturalistic fallacy. But would you agree that facts can be determined by values, and it is the task of philosophy to help discern and determine these values?
Well, yes, and I'll tell you what I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So what if you value the life of mountain lions and you value the role of mountain lion populations in the ecology, then that might direct how it might give you ideas for research projects and help you implement the projects in an ethical way. Is that what you're thinking of? Something like that?
Yes, exactly what I'm thinking. And because you say that this is sort of a related issue. You call for a moral revolution, but at the same time you acknowledge that arguments by themselves are not going to convince many people. So
Correct.
Where does that leave us, really?
Well, strategically, I think the thing we should be aiming for is for our own tribe of wildlife conservationists, people who are in the action or sympathetic with it and who are in the tradition of Aldo Leopold and Michael Slay and people like that. And I would add also Dave Foreman. We need to be united. We need to have a narrative that we agree on. We need to be able to make convincing arguments in certain kinds of circumstances. And to be maximally effective. And that's what I want to emphasize and hope that I can contribute to some extent. I don't have the power to direct the course of history. All I can do is try to be in touch with what's going on and figure out how I might be able to get involved and kind of kick the ball in the direction that I think it needs to go in. Same for all of us. But it's interesting in this connection that the Center for Biological Diversity supports the culling of the barred owls, and yet a lot of other groups do not. And I know what's at stake. The Endangered Species Act itself is in the sights of many people, and it needs to be protected. But we need to be able to sort these issues out and agree on them and make persuasive and convincing arguments with people who count. And over time, maybe we'll succeed in changing the course of things. That's my hope.
I see. So I read your comments on that controversy, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't really reach a decision yourself, do you?
No, I lean towards it's a bad idea strongly.
Okay.
But until I'm not going to tell the Center for Biological Diversity what they should be doing, except to say I think they need to do the very thing that I've been talking about. They need to start thinking more about the ethical underpinnings of their own mission and vision. And we all need to do that from time to time.
Do you find support or appreciation for wilderness in any of the major figures in the history of Western philosophy?
Well, there's Arne West, of course. Before that, I don't really know. I haven't thought about it very much.
What about Rousseau?
I'm not familiar with what Rousseau may have said about wilderness.
Okay.
But, the philosopher that I studied most intensively was a modern philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and particularly his later work, Philosophical Investigations and On Certainty. And he didn't talk about this, but it's interesting that he himself retreated to the wilderness from time to time to do his work. He built a little hut by himself above a fjord in Norway, for instance, and would go there in the summers to think and to write about philosophy.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so, my view is that wilderness preservation was just not a big issue at his time. And but he got benefit from visiting wilderness and hiking and things like that. So I think he would be very sympathetic with wilderness protection. And, then about the time I got into graduate school, or a little before, environmental philosophy or environmental ethics courses began to pop up in universities here and there. I was a little late or a little early for that. But nowadays there are quite a few philosophers who talk about these things. And I don't follow them very closely. I don't have time to. But, it's good that philosophy is starting to pay more attention to these issues. I'll say that.
In recent comments, you said that the best argument to present to trophy hunters is not that wild animals have intrinsic value, but rather that wild animals are sentient creatures with feelings, consciousness, and a self. I like what you say because your argument keeps it real and avoids abstractions. The question is, you sometimes hear people say that, and this is a quote that I hear people say, wild animals were here first. How does this comment fit into the framework of your argument that it is best to appeal to the sentience of wild creatures versus appealing to their intrinsic value? I hope that question is clear.
Well, the importance of them being here first can only be understood, I think, intelligibly within the context of ecology and their contributions to the healthy functioning of the biotic system, the biotic community, because obviously the individual animals living now weren't here a few hundred years ago. So, I don't put much stock in the here first element unless it's understood that way. But I think the fact that sentient creatures have a self is critical. What is it to have a self? That's something we haven't gotten into. It's one step beyond everything that I've said. But stones don't have selves,
right,
in the way that I flesh it out.
Yes, a unity of experiences across time, I believe is the way you define it.
Yeah, as they go through life pursuing their own good. A unified point of view on the world. The world is, in a sense, defined as their world. I think the mother cougar is going out to hunt for her kittens, encounters a world that, in a sense, is made for her via her particular kind of sensibilities and mind and instincts. So she responds to certain parts of it. She ignores certain parts she considers a threat or something to be avoided, and in other cases, something to be pursued. In the case of a deer, perhaps something to be killed, or kittens to be defended. And she, in the most abstract rendering of this, she's trying to stay alive and in good functioning condition and to contribute to the reproduction of her hind. Those are the ultimate goods that she pursues in everything she does. And having a self is part of that. She has a point of view on the world, and it changes as she learns and as she has various experiences, and it alters her behavior in certain ways. It's not as elaborate as the one that a human being might have, but it's fundamentally the same kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it's excellent and, very helpful philosophical way of looking at it. So we've been going a long time, but I have just a few more questions, if you would hang in there, regarding Aldo Leopold. I see a little tension myself between the land ethic and wilderness in the work of Leopold, because as you point out, the land ethic is about proper use of the land. But when it comes to discussing wilderness, we're no longer talking about using the land. We're talking about really leaving it alone, as you point out. So I don't see how the protection of wilderness really falls under the land ethic myself.
Well, except to the extent that it protects the biotic community, perhaps it doesn't. But of course, Leopold was all for wilderness. In fact, there's the Aldo Leopold Wilderness and the Gila Wilderness, and that we owe to him. And so he was a champion of the wilderness idea. I think a lot of it was he just enjoyed being in the wilderness. He liked taking a pack trip for a week or two in the wilderness and observing nature and making notes and contemplating things. And I think that's one of the values of wilderness for us human beings. And but I don't think his land ethic really provides a strong moral underpinning for that, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you on that. So, last question. Would you say then, this, I'm not referring to Leopold here, I'm asking you, that wilderness has no intrinsic value, but it has value because it sustains sentient life?
Yeah, of course. If we have a moral obligation to, as I put it earlier, leave mountain lions alone, then we need to leave their habitat alone too. Okay. Right? Because they depend on their habitat. And that habitat includes other plants and animals, and it includes the streams, the mountains, whatever's there. So we have a moral obligation, in my view, to protect wilderness for that reason. Mm-hmm. And
right.
Beyond that, I think we humans need it, as we talked about earlier.
I want to thank you for coming on my show. I love the way you are bringing ethics into the science of ecology. As you say, facts by themselves cannot accomplish anything. It's the proper value-driven actions of human beings that will determine the final outcome. Thank you, Kirk.
Very well put, Glenn, and thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email, wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org.